Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 74th class in our series on the history of the Baha'i Faith, well, really the history of the Abrahamic religions. And we've come to the end of the presentations, the formal presentations on the revelation or the dispensation of Bahá'u'lláh. Tonight, we're going to deal with the succession, what happens after Bahá'u'lláh passes, and so far as the history of the faith is concerned. We'll spend tonight on the aftermath of that event most immediately, and then we'll spend a couple more classes on the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá, on the guardianship of Shoghi Effendi, a couple of 2 or 3 classes on that, and then same thing with the evolution of the Baha'i administrative order during the 20th century, mostly until the election of the House of Justice. And then we will, as I said before, go to a more informal discussion about Baha'i ideas and concepts based largely on books I've written. I see a dear friend of mine, Donald Boney, from my grammar school and high school days is with us tonight. And so welcome, Donald. So these, while the classes we have tonight and have been having are primarily dedicated to those who are already fairly familiar with the Baha'i history or Baha'i teachings, the future, and we are going to meet weekly, as I said last week, every week instead of every other week. We'll sort of begin in a more of a fireside format, a discussion. And I will tell you in advance what the topic will be so you can send in questions if you have them. And we will deal with the questions that you might like to have answered the next time in the Q&A that follows. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen to do the slides. Start with what I mean by the twin pillars of religion, because this is not some formal term in the Baha'i teachings per se, but it is a formal concept. What is meant? What do I mean by that? Obviously, I mean the twin pillars that uphold any religion, and not just the Baha'i faith. In this holy cycle, the learned are, on the one hand, the hands of the cause of God, and on the other, the teachers and diffusers of his teachings who did not rank his hands, but who have attained an eminent position in the teaching work. As to the rulers, they refer to the members of the local, national, and international houses of justice. The duties of each of these souls will be determined in the future. Now, this is, I think, from Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, we're talking about a reference to a passage from the Kitab-i-Aqdas by Baha'u'lláh, where he first mentions the learned and the rulers as upholding the religion of the Baha'i faith. And what does he mean by that? Well, we've discussed this before, and we will discuss it a little more tonight. He's talking about the fact that you have two lines of order in every religion. One are the spiritual teachings, or one constitutes the spiritual teachings, and the other constitutes the administration of that, who's in charge of the religion. And in every religion, we have had a problem, and in time, eventually you have a time, both in the distinction between spiritual teachings, which are always essentially the same concepts, but repeated in a language and updated in a applicability to the situation that obtains in society at the time that one of the prophets comes. So the spiritual teachings of Moses, the Ten Commandments and so forth are still in effect during the time of Christ. In fact, it's been noted several times that the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, and various other spiritual concepts are prevalent in every religion. But the administration, who succeeds when the prophet dies? Of course, Moses appointed Joshua, and Christ presumably appointed Peter. Muhammad appointed Ali, and so on. And Baha'u'lláh appointed Abdu'l-Bahá, as we know. And this passage, which is a very favorite one of mine in relation to these two aspects of religious order, the spiritual teachings and the administrative teachings, are stated this very powerfully in this passage from The World Order of Baha'u'lláh by Shoghi Effendi. He says, it should be remembered by every follower of the cause that the system of Baha'i administration is not an innovation imposed arbitrarily upon the Baha'is of the world. Since the Master's passing, but derives its authority from the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá, is specifically prescribed in unnumbered tablets, and rests in some of its essential features upon the explicit provisions of the Kitabi Aqdas. It thus unifies and correlates the principles separately laid down by Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá, and is indissolubly bound with the essential verities of the faith. To dissociate the administrative principles of the cause from the purely spiritual and humanitarian teachings would be tantamount to a mutilation of the body of the cause, a separation that can only result in the disintegration of its component parts and the extinction of the faith itself. So this is how important the collaboration and coexistence of these two pillars of religion are. They're inseparable from one another. You can't have one functioning without the other. And so when one falls apart, or they become at odds, or and so on, and which usually happens because beyond perhaps the next successor, the administrative order of the religion is sort of put together haphazardly by the followers, and the religion soon becomes dysfunctional for various reasons. And we've talked about that in the past, what happened with Judaism, what happened with Christianity, with Islam, and the Baha'i Faith to a certain extent, where you have those who recognize Baha'u'lláh and what Baha'u'lláh calls the people of the Bayan, who are those who continue to follow the Bab, even though the Bab, he didn't appoint Baha'u'lláh, but he indicated that Baha'u'lláh, or him whom God will make manifest, would succeed him. And of course, the importance of the so-called of the covenant, which we discussed last time, of Baha'u'lláh, the Kitabi where he wrote a will and testament designating Abdu'l-Bahá as his successor. So what happened insofar as the succession of the Baha'i Faith? You can say, well, unlike every other religion, because the prophet appointed an explicit successor and what his duties and functions and powers were, you don't have the schism in the Baha'i Faith. But you did have, and that's what it's about tonight, you did have attempts to cause such a schism. So don't think simply because the Baha'u'lláh left a will and testament and directives about how the faith, the administrative order of the faith would be established, that there weren't problems. There were, because there were, as with other religions, people vying for power. And in the case of Abdu'l-Bahá, it was his half-brother, Mirza Muhammad Ali. Now, before we get into that, however, I wanted to just insert a personal observation, and that is, to me, this inseparability of the administrative order from the spiritual teachings in religion is comparable in a way to the first paragraph of the most holy book of Baha'u'lláh, the Book of His Laws, where he says there are two duties incumbent upon the individual. And as you can see here, he says, excuse me, I'm sorry. Just skipped ahead here. Hold on. He said, these twin duties are inseparable. Neither is acceptable without the other. Now, what are those duties? Well, the first duty is the spiritual duty, the recognition of the manifestation, the recognition that he is the promised one, foreseen and prophesied by the previous prophets. So Judaism prophesies the Messiah. Christianity prophesies the Paraclete or the Comforter, which is Muhammad, and Muhammad prophesies the coming of him who will bring in the day of judgment, and so on. That's the first duty. The second one is to be obedient to the laws that the manifestation lays down. So he says, who reaches this sublime station, this summit of transcendent glory, to observe every ordinance of him who is the desire of the world. These twin duties are inseparable. Neither is acceptable without the other. And so this is the same thing if you think about it, and that is the spiritual teachings of the faith have to do with your daily conduct, your comportment, your obedience to specific laws, and your love of your fellow man, and so on. But those the daily guidance, the laws that govern your daily life, that prescribe certain behaviors, prohibit certain behaviors, and so on. This is in effect the administration of your life. So it's comparable, as you can see, these twin inseparable aspects of religion in your life, your spiritual understanding of spiritual teachings, but the laws that regulate and govern your life, that you can't have one without the other. Then I wanted to cite you a passage that is another favorite of mine, insofar as the fact that even though Bahá'u'lláh dies in 1892, he as a soul, as a spiritual being, even as every human being continues to live after this life, but the manifestation has an authority beyond that of normal human beings. And this is a passage where Shoghi Effendi in God Passes By talks about quotes from, it's not a quote, he acknowledges that he got the idea from Abdu'l-Bahá. So let me read it. Yet as the appointed center of Baha'u'llah's covenant, and that's Abdu'l-Bahá, and the authorized interpreter of his teachings had himself later explained, the dissolution of the tabernacle wherein the soul of the manifestation of God had chosen temporarily to abide, in other words, the human body, the human persona of Baha'u'lláh, signalized its release from the restrictions which an earthly life had of necessity imposed upon it. So his death did not, in effect, prevent him from assisting the Baha'i Faith. It released him from the restrictions that being in a human persona imposed. And then he goes on to say, its influence no longer circumscribed by any physical limitation, its radiance no longer beclouded by its human temple, that soul could henceforth energize the whole world to agree unapproached at any stage in the course of its existence on this planet. So that's comforting to know. And that's true, of course, with every religion, that the soul or the reality of the prophet continues to live on and govern and guide and inspire and assist the religion that he has revealed. And this is where we get to this concept of a day that will not be followed by night. What is meant by that? Well, it can mean a lot of things. The general inference that most people who read this passage mean that we will, that you will not have the destruction or obliteration of the Baha'i institutions that you had with the previous religions because of the covenant. But it also means that history itself, human history, has achieved a point of transformation, a point of maturation, as the Baha'u'lláh calls it, where we no longer will have these peaks and valleys. Obviously, there will be peaks and valleys, but these significant ones where civilization deteriorates completely. So that's another interpretation of it. But let's look at the specific interpretation of this, what this means, by Shoghi Effendi. He says, the cloud of despondency that had momentarily settled on the disconsolate lovers of the cause of Baha'u'lláh was lifted. Now, what he's talking about, of course, is that when Baha'u'lláh passed, the despondency of the believers, which you can imagine was most grievous, the continuity of that unerring guidance vouchsafed to it since its birth was now assured. So because the Baha'is, the followers, knew that there was a covenant and knew who would succeed, they weren't as shaken as they would have been had there been no such document and no such appointment. The significance of the solemn affirmation that this is the day which shall not be followed by night was now clearly apprehended. An orphaned community had recognized in Abdu'l-Bahá, in its hour of desperate need, its solace, its guide, its mainstay and champion, the light that had glowed with such dazzling brightness in the heart of Asia and had in both the lifetime of Baha'u'lláh spread to the Near East and illumined the fringes of both the European and African continents, was to travel through the impelling influence of the newly proclaimed covenant, and almost immediately after the death of its author, as far west as North American continent. Of course, he's referring here to during the time of Abdu'l-Bahá, where the Baha'i Faith arose in America, especially after Abdu'l-Bahā's visit, which reinforced that community, and thence diffuse itself to the countries of Europe. And of course, Abdu'l-Bahá visited there, and subsequently shed its radiance over both the Far East and Australasia. And these were the results of the teaching of Martha Root, who took the faith to Europe and the Far East, and the Duns who pioneered to Australasia. So in other words, during the time of Abdu'l-Bahá, you had the faith spread to Europe, North America, the Far East, and to Australasia, to Australia and the area surrounding Australia. Alone and unaided. Now, alone and unaided is a phrase that I've taken from the passages dealing with the manifestations, because they are persecuted. In the case of Christ, martyred, and in the case of the Bab, killed by execution, by firing squad, and so on. So they are really mostly on their own, even though they have the followers, the close followers who assist them. This picture, which has been colorized, is extremely meaningful in a number of ways. But I've put alone and unaided because Abdu'l-Bahá, in other words, now we have these two pillars of the religion fully established. You have the administrative order, which is completely established through universal suffrage, so that every Baha'i participates either indirectly or directly in electing the House of Justice, which is the governing body of the Baha'i Faith. And we also have all of the spiritual teachings of Baha'u'lláh, and explicated and expounded on by Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi. But Abdu'l-Bahá himself was also alone and unaided, and we're going to see a little glimpse of why I say that. Another thing I love about this picture is he's holding prayer beads. And you would think, well, if someone as spiritual as he is, why would he need these? They're really counting beads, aren't they? You count how many times you say a prayer. And to me, it's almost a teaching event where he's saying, if I need these, you most certainly do. Meaning not you need these set of prayer beads, but if I repeat my prayers a certain number of times and so on, if it's that important to me, surely, since I am the exemplar, you who are not exemplary certainly need them. So Baha'u'lláh was tested even as, Abdu'l-Bahá was tested severely. And there are books I will explain to you next class that go into this in great detail. They're very dramatic and very interesting, but we're going to sort of skim over the scenario that happened as soon as Baha'u'lláh died. And that's what we're going to cover tonight, the testing that occurred. The true ground of this crisis, the crisis we're talking about, and I say at every transition, you have that crisis in the transition between the Bab and Baha'u'lláh, you have that transition between Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá, you have that crisis at the transition between Abdu'l-Bahá and Shoghi Effendi, and you have Shoghi Effendi facing crisis after crisis until finally the House of Justice is established, and the crises are the establishment of the world order Baha'u'lláh is finished, and you don't have those kinds of transition. Doesn't mean you don't have testing. It doesn't mean you don't have problems, but you don't have these questions of who's leading this religion. So we read last week that Baha'u'lláh specifically in his will and testament appointed Abdu'l-Bahá to be his successor, and the successor after him was to be Mirza Muhammad Ali, his half-brother. But Mirza Muhammad Ali was not satisfied with this lofty position and decided that he would usurp the authority of Abdu'l-Bahá. He became what is called in Persian a nakazim, which simply means a breaker of the covenant. The true ground for this crisis was the burning, the uncontrollable, the soul-festering jealousy which the admitted preeminence of Abdu'l-Bahá in rank, power, ability, knowledge, and virtue above all other members of his father's family had aroused not only in Mirza Muhammad Ali, the archbreaker of the covenant, but in some of the closest relatives as well, an envy as blind as that which had possessed the soul of Mirza Yahya, as deadly as that which the superior excellence of Joseph had kindled in the hearts of his brothers, and talking about Joseph and the brothers who left him to be killed, and of course they ended up finding him in Egypt, where he had ascended to power. As deep-seated as that which had blazed in the bosom of Cain and prompted him to slay his brother Abel, had for several years prior to Baha'u'llah's ascension been smoldering in the recesses of Mirza Muhammad Ali's heart, and had been secretly inflamed by those unnumbered marks of distinction, of admiration and favor accorded to Abdu'l-Bahá, not only by Baha'u'lláh himself, his companions and his followers, but by the vast number of unbelievers who had come to recognize that innate greatness which Abdu'l-Bahá had manifested from childhood. And of course, Abdu'l-Bahá was a remarkable individual, sort of a miracle, if you will. And so what happened, and how did it happen? Well, again, there's a whole book on this, and so I can only skim over the top, but we can do that. And I say the family and the near ones. By near ones, I mean those who were the closest to Abdu'l-Bahá, such as Mirza Jan, I've got listed here, who was the secretary for Baha'u'lláh. He joined this, and you wonder, how could someone who had been so close to Baha'u'lláh go against the very explicit guidance in his will and testament? Well, that's something we're going to get into, because Abdu'l-Bahá calls it says it's like a disease. Baha'u'llah's two surviving wives, his two sons, the vacillating Mirza Dayullah and the treacherous Mirza Badiullah, and we'll talk about Mirza Badiullah, that was Baha'u'llah's youngest son, with their sister and half-sister and their husbands, one of them the infamous Sayyid Ali, a kinsman of the Bab, the other the crafty Mirza Majuddin, together with his sister and half-brothers, the children of the noble, the faithful, and now deceased Aqi Kalim, that's Mirza Musa, the faithful brother of Baha'u'llah, all united in a determined effort to subvert the foundations of the covenant which the newly proclaimed will had laid. Even Mirza Jan, who for 40 years, and he was one of the first to believe in Baha'u'llah, had labored as Baha'u'llah's amanuensis, as well as Muhammad Javad Kazvani, who ever since the days of Adrianople had been engaged in transcribing the innumerable tablets revealed by the Supreme Pen, together with his entire family, threw in their lot with the covenant breakers and allowed themselves to be ensnared by their machinations. Forsaken, betrayed, assaulted by almost the entire body of his relatives, now congregated in the mansion. This is the mansion of Baji, where Baha'u'llah lived and where he passed away, and the neighboring houses clustered around the most holy tomb. Abdu'l-Bahá, already bereft of both his mother and his sons, and without any support at all save that of an unmarried sister, and that's Bahia Khanum, his 4 unmarried daughters, his wife, and his uncle, a half-brother of Baha'u'llah, was left alone to bear in the face of a multitude of enemies arrayed against him, from within and from without, the full brunt of the terrific responsibilities which his exalted office had laid upon him. So we're going to look at some of what was laid upon him, what some of the duties were, but also what was done. Let me take a sip of my tea. So what were the machinations of Mirza Muhammad Ali? To friend and stranger, believer and unbeliever alike, to officials high and low, openly and by insinuation, verbally as well as in writing, they represented Abdu'l-Bahá as an ambitious, self-willed, unprincipled, and pitiless usurper who had deliberately disregarded the testamentary instructions of his father, who had in language intentionally veiled and ambiguous, assumed a rank co-equal with the manifestation himself. Now, what they're referring to here is they claim that Abdu'l-Bahá was claiming to be a manifestation. And so that's why, as we said last time, he took the title Abdu'l-Bahá, Abd meaning servant, of Allah, of God, servant of Baha'u'llah, not Allah, of Bahá, a servant of his father. So he can't be co-equal if he is a servant of, who in his communications with the West was beginning to claim to be the return of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who would come in the glory of the Father. Now, this is not what he claimed. This is what they're saying he claimed, who in his letters to the Indian believers was proclaiming himself as the promised Shah Bahram, and arrogating to himself the right to interpret the writing of his father, to inaugurate a new dispensation, and to share with him the most great infallibility, the exclusive prerogative of the holders of the prophetic office. He it was, and this is, the he here is Mirza Muhammad Ali, his half-brother. He it was who had the impudence and temerity to tell Abdu'l-Bahá to his face that just as Umar had succeeded in usurping the successorship of the Prophet Muhammad, he too felt himself able to do the same. He it was, and of course, again, those of you who've been in the class the whole time, remember we talked about how Umar plotted to not follow the instructions of Muhammad, who had clearly made Ali his successor, but instead to elect a caliph. And that's how you have the separation at the death of Muhammad between the Sunni and Shia sects of Islam. So he it was who, obsessed by the fear that he might not survive Abdu'l-Bahá, had the moment he had been assured by him that all the honor he coveted would in the course of time be his, swiftly rejoined that he had no guarantee that he would outlive him. He it was who, as testified by Mirza Bahá'u'lláh in his confession, and we're going to look at part of that confession. And this is a very interesting story because Mirza Bahá'u'lláh, the youngest son of Baha'u'llah, was at first a follower of Mirza Muhammad Ali, joined him, but then he wrote this elaborate and beautifully written confession, which we're going to look at part of, as I said, in which he said all of these pernicious stuff, described it in detail that Mirza Mahali had done. Written and published on the occasion of his repentance and his short-lived reconciliation with Abdu'l-Bahá, had, while Baha'u'llah's body was still awaiting interment, carried off by a ruse the two satchels containing his father's most precious documents, entrusted him prior to his ascension to Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, what this is about, and again, this is a story we can't tell in full tonight, is that because Abdu'l-Bahá had to tend to preparing Baha'u'llah's body for interment and so on, he left a satchel that Baha'u'llah had given in trust to him, full of the writings, documents, seal rings, all kinds of things, and gave them to Mirza Muhammad Ali to keep securely. And almost immediately, he hid them away from Abdu'l-Bahá, and they were never seen again. He it was, and again, this is typical of the Shoghi Effendi's writing. He has these parallel sentences that go on very lengthily, but that are incredibly beautiful and informative. He it was, and again, the he here is Mirza Muhammad Ali. He it was who, by an exceedingly adroit and simple forgery of a word recurring in some of the denunciatory passages addressed by the Supreme Pen to Mirza Yahya, and by other devices such as mutilation and interpolation, had succeeded in making them directly applicable to a brother whom he hated with such consuming passion. And lastly, it was this same Mirza Muhammad Ali, who is attested by Abdu'l-Bahá in his will, had with circumspection and guile conspired to take his life, an intention indicated by the allusions made in a letter written to Shu'ila, son of Mirza Muhammad Ali, the original of which was enclosed in that same document by Abdu'l-Bahá. So he even plotted to have Abdu'l-Bahá, his own brother, killed. And we'll get to that another time. More specifically, Baha'u'llah had, referring to Mirza Muhammad Ali, because Baha'u'llah was well aware of everything around him and was well aware of the jealousy of Mirza Muhammad Ali. Referring to Mirza Muhammad Ali in clear and unequivocal language, affirmed, "He verily is but one of my servants. Should he for a moment pass out from under the shadow of the cause, he surely shall be brought to naught." Furthermore, in a no less empathetic language, he, again, Baha'u'llah, in a connection with Mirza Muhammad Ali, had stated, "By God the True One, were we for a single instant to withhold from him the outpourings of our cause, he would wither and would fall upon the dust." Now, the astounding confession of Baha'u'llah. I used to have a copy of this original document, but it's available to you online, and I have it right here on this slide. So if you download the slide, you can go to that document and read the whole thing. It's very, very informative. This was published in Chicago by the Baha'i Publishing Society in 1907. The following English translation is a confession and epistle written by Mirza Bahá'u'lláh, half-brother of Abdu'l-Bahá, born of Baha'u'llah's second marriage to Fatima Khanum. So far as is known, the epistle has not appeared in print in its entirety. Since then, the original publication served as a central point of defense of the cause at the time when the center of the covenant, Abdu'l-Bahá, was imperiled by descendants of Bahá'u'lláh, and this is when he was in danger of being executed. Bahá'u'llah's epistle is cited twice in the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá and is therefore essential reading. Passages from the epistle were quoted, however, in the Covenant of Bahá'u'lláh, which is one of the books I want you to read if you have a chance, and other references in the Babi and Baha'i religions by Mujan Momin. So Abdu'l-Bahá describes covenant breaking. You think, why would someone turn against the very religion to which they have dedicated their lives? It's a very strange phenomenon. And sometimes it's caused by cynicism. Sometimes it's because if you're part of the family of the prophet, you see him only as your brother or your father, or, you know, just a normal human being, and you want to have the prestige that he has, or in this case, that Abdu'l-Bahá has. So you could see where jealousy, if you have a brother or a sister and that brother or sister was accorded such a high rank, you can imagine that you too might be jealous if you had tried very hard to accomplish a great deal yourself. Ironically, in spite of his explicit allegiance to Abdu'l-Bahá in this confession, talking about Bahá'u'lláh, and his detailed account of the spurious claims and explicit malfeasance of Mirza Muhammad Ali, and he goes into great detail about the specific things, how he changed some of the writings of Baha'u'lláh and circulated them and so on. He later rejoined the Nakazin, the covenant breakers. In other words, after confessing and acknowledging that it was all a ruse, that he well knew that Abdu'l-Bahá was the appointed successor, he went back with Mirza Muhammad Ali. So why does that occur? Well, that's why I've titled this slide, The Pathology of Covenant Breaking. Equally ironic is that this was translated by the letter was translated into English by Dr. Aminullah Farid, who also later became a covenant breaker himself. So what are some of the examples of this disease? And this is a quote from a cable. If somebody's got your microphone on, please mute yourself. This is a cable sent to Roy Wilhelm in 1921 by Abdu'l-Bahá. He who sits with lepers catches leprosy. He who is with Christ shuns Pharisees and abhors Judas Iscariot. Certainly shun violators, inform Goodall, True, and Parsons telegraphically. What he's talking about here is he was being asked, what should we do by those people in our own community? Because by this time, this same rebellion had spread to America by George Kirilla and Farid and others. Because some of you may know that Phoebe Hearst, the woman who was the very rich, wealthy woman who became a Baha'i, was approached by, sort of tricked into contributing lots of money to Kirilla, who said he was building a hospital on Mount Carmel, which was not the truth. So this is a letter written on behalf of the Guardian about covenant breaking. Covenant breaking is truly a spiritual disease, and the whole viewpoint and attitude of a covenant breaker is so poisonous that the master likened it to leprosy and warned the friends to breathe the same air was dangerous. This should not be taken literally. He meant when you are close enough to breathe the same air, you are close enough to contact their corrupting influence. Your sister should never imagine, and this was written to somebody about their sister, she, loyal and devoted, has become a carrier. In other words, this isn't something that happens magically. That's not what is meant by spiritual disease. It simply means that you avoid association with them because they will poison your mind with their cynicism. And I can give you some good examples of that in the Q&A of some interesting parallels. This is then the hyperlink to the entire epistle. And this is a quote from it. In brief, this servant has understood their intentions and realized that they're only talking about Mirza Muhammad Ali and his followers, though he was one of them. Is contradiction, and their only purpose is to confuse and mislead the weak ones and to confound the single-minded. Therefore, I have entirely turned away from them and have taken firm hold upon the covenant of God. I have forsaken the left hand of error and sought the right hand of perfect assurance. Mirza Khan wrote something before his death. This is a continuation of Mirza Bahá'u'llah's confession. Now the Nakazin have recently added certain passages to it, have interpolated it, and are intending to publish that spurious copy. Let it be known that even Mirza Khan, in his last days, having learned their designs, repented and endeavored to return to the covenant. Now they have lately written a false writing in his name, which bears many signatures. Note ye that we, those who have returned to Abdu'l-Bahá, do not sanction and are quit of the contents thereof. And it continues. The intention of this servant of the sublime threshold in writing this paper is to elucidate briefly that which has occurred in these days and in those days of the past, and to reveal to the pure minds of the beloved of the past, and to reveal to the pure minds of the beloved of God that which will tend to make them confident and assured. Thus they may remain firm in the covenant and be protected from breaking it. O ye beloved of God, the question of stealing the traces. Now, this is where he is specifically referring to Mirza Muhammad taking that satchel of writings. That's what traces means in Persian, one of its meanings. And here he's describing the fact that Mirza Muhammad Ali stole the satchel. The question of stealing the traces is as follows. During the days of the illness of the worship countenance, Bahá'u'lláh, the illness right before he died, the illness which preceded his departure, one day he summoned this servant to his presence and gave him the keys to his blessed depository and chest. Now, this servant, he's talking about to himself. So he gave the keys to Bahá'u'lláh, which were in his room, and ordered that the lock should be renewed. According to his command, this servant sent for Muhammad Khani and had him renew the locks, in other words, change the locks, which he did. And Mirza Ali Riza brought the locks and helped affix them in their places. We locked the doors and presented the keys to him, and he said, keep them. He also ordered that the key to my own depository to my room be renewed, and this was done. So he changed the locks on the rooms. This is in the mansion of Baji, and you know, if you've been there, there's a major hallway, and then these other rooms go off of that major sort of lobby. And so here's what he says happened. He took away all the traces of the supreme pen and the special tablets revealed for the beloved of God. When this servant, in other words, when I, Bahá'u'lláh, reproached him and endeavored to reclaim them, he spoke so much that should I attempt to write it here, Masnavi becomes 70 pounds of paper, an expression meaning that the matter is most voluminous. Among other things, he said to me that the preservation of the blessed writings was referred to him by a blessed command that he possessed a tablet from the supreme pen to that effect. He did not even allow the servant to read the writings. In other words, he couldn't read the writings. It didn't show him such a tablet. By various means, he endeavored to insinuate to this servant that His Holiness, the greatest branch, that would be Abdu'l-Bahá, was against the blessed law, that if the blessed writings fell into his hands, they would be effaced and no name of the blessed beauty would remain in the world. So the rest of the story, as I say, is even more grievous. These are just citing some of the events. They occupied Baji. They would not allow Abdu'l-Bahá to go in there. And for a long time, he couldn't even visit the grave of his father. Then they made accusations to the government that Abdu'l-Bahá wasn't giving them, not giving them money when he was. They tried to have him executed. They asserted that when Abdu'l-Bahá started building the shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel, that this was really a fortress to attack the city, and so on. So the Covenant of Bahá'u'lláh by Abdi, there are two books by Adib Tahirzadeh that are really very important, and frankly, even though they're quite lengthy, very interesting and exciting reading. You know, it's very much like a detective story, and it has a happy ending, fortunately. So the Covenant of Bahá'u'lláh is the history of this whole period, and then the Child of the Covenant by Adib Tahirzadeh is about the will and testament of Abdu'l-Bahá and how it came about. This is something I thought you might be interested in. This is a picture of Mirza Muhammad Ali, one when he was in his teens. This is in this one on the left, taken in Adrianople. This is when he, and this is very interesting, this is in a paper in Charlotte, North Carolina. And this is where he claimed to succeed his brother as the leader of the Baha'i Faith. Muhammad Ali has been chosen successor to the late Abdu'l-Bahá. Now, Abdu'l-Bahá died in 1921. He lived, Mirza Muhammad Ali, to 1937. So he outlived by Abdu'l-Bahá by almost 20 years. And of course, he was not the chosen successor. Shoghi Effendi was. So at any rate, it's very interesting how you can see how this gets noised about. So I'm going to close with what happened to him eventually, ultimately. This is by Shoghi Effendi. And one of the last pages in this section of God Passes By, one of the last pages in God Passes By. Surviving Abdu'l-Bahá by almost 20 years, he who had so audaciously affirmed to his face that he had no assurance he might outlive him, lived long enough to witness the utter bankruptcy of his cause, that is, his followers, those of Mirza Muhammad Ali, leading meanwhile to a wretched existence within the walls of a mansion that had once housed a crowd of his supporters, was denied by the civil authority as a result of the crisis he had after Abdu'l-Bahā's passing foolishly precipitated the official custody of his father's tomb, was compelled a few years later to vacate that same mansion, which through his flagrant neglect had fallen into a dilapidated condition, was stricken with paralysis which crippled half his body, lay bedridden in pain for months before he died, and was buried according to Muslim rites in the immediate vicinity of a local Muslim shrine, his grave remaining until the present day devoid of even a tombstone, a pitiful reminder of the hollowness of the claims he had advanced, of the depths of the infamy to which he had sunk, and of the severity of the retribution his acts had so richly merited. So that is the presentation tonight. Next week, we will begin to survey some of the works and the life of Abdu'l-Bahá. We won't spend as much time on it as it needs, because there's just so much that's been done that's available to you that says it much better than I could. But I will clue you into where those things are, what they say, and try to give you a head start on that.